box before we get started. It says we're live. Hello, hello out there in internet land. Does somebody just want to say hi in the chat box? Let me know that you can see us and hear us. That would be fantastic. It does say we have people waiting to join us, so I'm going to assume that it's going to let them join us now that we are live. There we go. Welcome, welcome, guys. All right, Christy said hi, so I know at least one person can see us and hear us. All right, guys, welcome to day 2 of the Lemonade Conference. I'm Melissa Breau, for any of those of you who don't know me. And this is our free lunchtime panel discussion as part of the conference, brought to you by Fenzi Dog Sports Academy and the IAABC Foundation. I always try and invert those first 2 letters for some reason. If anybody attending this wants to apply for CEUs for this talk, you can find the link to access that quiz at thelemonadeconference.com/CEU, and I will drop that link in the chat box once we get going. Our topic today is It's All in How They're Raised, or Is It? And I have Jessica Hekman, Kim Brophy, and Sharon Carroll here with me to discuss that for roughly the next hour. If we do have a bit of time at the end, we'll open up to attendee questions. I know we didn't get to that yesterday, so just kind of setting expectations a little bit there. I know these ladies have a lot to say. All right, so I want to give everybody a chance to introduce themselves, share a bit about your background. Feel free to plug your conference talk if you want. Jessica, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I am Jessica Hekman. I am a veterinary researcher, so a double doctor. I have a veterinary degree. My PhD is in genetics, specifically of animal behavior. I have a bunch of different jobs currently. So I work part-time at the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard studying the genetics of dog behavior. I also am teaching as part of the Virginia Tech Animal Behavior and Welfare online master's degree, which might be of some interest to any of you who are interested in going deeper and getting a master's in that stuff. So that could be something for some of you to check out. And I run a nonprofit called the Functional Dog Collaborative with an associated podcast where we look into a lot of the questions that we're going to be talking about at this panel today. I did have a talk yesterday. It was not about this kind of canine genetics and behavior. It was about probiotics. But for those of you who are interested in learning about the research that I'm involved in, both Eleanor Carlson and Catherine Lord, Eleanor is the head of my lab and Catherine is another researcher at my lab. They are both giving talks at Lemonade, and those are going to be some great ones to get some good canine science out of.
Awesome. All right. Kim, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself second?
Sure. So I'm Kim Brophy, and I'm an applied ethologist and the owner of the Dog Door Behavior Center in Asheville, North Carolina. And I also am the author of Meet Your Dog, a book that came out a few years ago. For anyone who's looking for it, it is sold out in hard copy, but you can get the ebook or you can get the audiobook till the next round is actually printed. Recently, in the last year, we've established the full Legs Applied Ethology Family Dog Mediation course. And that's been really exciting. So we've got almost 800 students worldwide right now. And it's been really cool just having a new group of individuals or a platform for some discussions about some of the sciences that affect canine behavior that aren't necessarily part of the mainstream dialogue historically. And so that's been really good. I'm also one of the hosts of the Beyond the Operant kind of series that we've done on YouTube with Kathy Murphy and Andrew Hale. That's been really fun and interesting, and had a bunch of interesting guests and stuff on there. And yeah, so we have a presentation here at the Lemonade Conference that was earlier today, but people can go back and watch it if they missed it, called The Antecedent Iceberg. And I'm excited to be here for this lunch panel.
Awesome. Sharon?
I've been a professional animal trainer for over 30 years. During that time, I decided you don't know what you don't know. So I decided to go to uni, and I originally got a bachelor's degree in equine science, and then a grad cert and a grad dip in captive vertebrate management, so wildlife and exotics for zoo sciences. Then I went on to do a master's in animal science and study animal behavior and animal science. And at the moment, I'm doing a PhD in veterinary pharmacology, looking at behavior meds. So I also compete in dog sports, a variety of dog sports. And my conference topic is on working with sensitive dogs. It's actually in the last spot on Sunday. So I'd love people to join me, because I'm pretty sure most people will be conferenced out by then, and I don't want an empty chat room. So I would love people to come and say hi. And certainly working with those more atypical dogs, those dogs that struggle to learn with the more common approaches, is something I really focus on. And so I work for Fenzi, and I'm on the Fenzi faculty, and teach a couple of classes, specifically one for the dogs that are more likely to become behaviourally inhibited and sort of hesitate and slow and freeze and shut down. And also the course I'm running right at the moment is the opposite, those dogs that get overly excited or overly aroused by the fact that they're a little confused or concerned or uncomfortable, and those dogs that sort of start to spin and bark and get overexcited or over agitated or aroused. That's the other class that I'm running at the moment. So that's a little bit about me and what I do.
And registration is still open through the 15th. So, all right. So to jump into things, I want to talk about dog personalities, I guess. So typically we kind of say the way that dogs behave and the way that they act and who they are is a combination of genetics and life experiences. So I wanted to ask you all, are those the only two factors that kind of play into who a dog is? Are there other things that can have an impact on that? Jessica, do you want to start?
Yeah. So the way I look at it is that, yeah, it is all either genetics or life experiences, but I define life experiences, I think, in a broader way than people default to thinking about. So from my perspective, your life experience starts at conception. So you're already having experiences when you're 1 cell, when you're 8 cells, you're having experiences in your mother's uterus. You're having experiences when you are a tiny little puppy in the nest, at a stage when you're not interacting with humans very much, but you're interacting with your siblings, probably actually a lot more than a lot of us really think about, maybe competing for the right nipple, learning that you are the one who is going to beat up or the one who is going to be beaten up. All that kind of stuff is all super important. So that is how I would define life experiences. And I'd say that probably anything else that you would say is sort of an additional thing, I would probably end up wrapping into life experiences as part of that definition.
Yeah, and Jessica, I really I appreciate your characterization there. That's kind of like the nature and the nurture, that within the nurture piece is a lot bigger, than what we've traditionally thought about. In the legs model that we kind of use in my program, that the book is written about, it just kind of, it expands on that to give them designations of, the learning part, like what are the kind of take home messages and whatnot that the organism's getting throughout their life from the cell division number 1, to the current state that they're in now, to also just thinking in a really literal sense for the role that it plays about the environment. And I think that's where, for me, I try to get more conversation and consideration about that environmental piece. And Sharon, it was interesting listening to you describe your experience and about, just kind of animals in captivity, like wild animals in captivity, and thinking about welfare issues there. And I think sometimes, my perspective is that a lot of the behaviors that we're seeing in dogs these days are in part due to kind of a dysfunction that's occurring between current pet conditions and then, the phenotype of what the animals are to begin with, how they have been for thousands of years, and how that fits or doesn't with some of our current expectations. So that environment piece, I think, is part of the life experience. But I think, sometimes it needs more emphasis. So I like to think about that kind of a little separately. And then the internal kind of conditions, of the health of the animal, like your other talk about the probiotics. I was watching earlier your presentation on that today, and it was just really interesting hearing you talk about all of the different things that can be going on that can be, influencing behavior in a variety of ways that we don't think about. That it's like there's a whole world inside the organism.
Yeah, we're not just one thing. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I just think it's so much more complicated than just how we raise them. Yeah. Thinking it's just what we train them to do or what we're deliberately doing has been
right. I'd say it's how we raise them, but what is how we raise them? There's so much that we don't control.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Anything you want to add, Sharon?
Probably not. I mean, realistically, that covers the whole spectrum. I guess the important part is that a lot of people don't consider that part until we pick up the puppy. Like a lot of people go, oh, their life starts when we pick them up.
Mm.
And you know, that doesn't, it started in utero. So, you know, how was the mother raised? What was the mother's nutrition like? You know, did she have significant traumas occur? You know, so we've got to look at the mother while the pups are in utero. We've got to then look at how they're raised by her and their interactions with the siblings, how they're raised, the environment that they're in. And then even when we look at sort of, we look at, often say the genetics component, but you know, the epigenetics, you know, what did the parents have a significant trauma that occurred? So maybe we're looking at a line of dogs that have always been these amazing, successful, competitive dogs, and you're buying or acquiring a dog from that line. But maybe that father had a significant trauma occur, and epigenetics play a role at that point. And so the significant traumas that occur can get passed on. It's not just the DNA. And so just factoring that in, and then, you know, just really recognizing that life experience isn't just about from when we pick that puppy up. There's a whole lot more involved than that.
Yeah. It totally is. I would want to weigh in a little bit about epigenetics, because I would say that certainly on the mother's side, if the mother's had a trauma, her behavior can explain a lot of how she can pass that on to her puppies. We see that so clearly in humans, particularly. Yeah. So when I think of epigenetics, I tend to think of that as part of how the body learns, starting from conception. What the popular press has done a crap job of explaining is that epigenetic markers get wiped out at conception, and that single cell starts fresh. There's some stuff that gets passed on. So we call this transgenerational epigenetics. If there's some sort of behavior or trait that is passed on from the parents to the children solely through epigenetic markers, we would call that transgenerational epigenetics. And the science around that shows that it does happen, but it's pretty poorly understood and pretty rare, and most of those markers do get wiped away. So I think when we're looking at trauma being passed on from parents, a lot of the time what you're seeing is like the dam who's had trauma herself, when she's passing that on even from the moment that the baby is conceived, like the hormonal soup, the information that she's giving the baby starting right then can pass that trauma on. And the baby can save that themselves epigenetically, but it's different from passing it on with the epigenetics sort of being passed from parent to child, if that makes sense.
But the evidence is so compelling. When we look at, say, the mouse studies where we look at while the pups, you know, are still under maternal care, and we stress those pups and significantly stress those pups, then we take those pups that have now got neurotic tendencies, and we take one of those male pups and we breed that to a healthy female that's got typical traits. And then we see those neurotic tendencies in those pups that have been raised by what was a healthy female. Then we start to find that interesting. And also in the human studies, when we see specifically some of the work that's been done with Holocaust survivors, for example, the trauma that they experienced was so significant that when we look at that offspring, even the offspring that have been adopted, so not raised by that family, so not raised with the nurture of someone who's been in trauma, but we look at the tendencies of those people, we see the effect of trauma. Even though they haven't been raised in that household. So it's separate to the nurture. There's something there. We don't know enough about epigenetics yet. We don't even know if there's something else that we haven't even learned about yet. But we do see the effect of it when we look at the studies.
Yeah, that mouse study was super interesting. To my knowledge, it was never replicated, but it opened up, as you say, so many questions about how trauma can be passed on. The Holocaust stuff, again, I think there's a lot of possibility that that's coming through the uterus. It's very hard in humans because we can't do the studies in humans to take that baby out of the uterus. Yeah. Right? Cool. We don't do that.
Yeah, it's a little tricky. Yeah. But it's just probably, I mean, we're rounding this question out. It's just worth noting that there's so much we still don't know.
That is
And
for sure. Yeah.
certainly when it comes to trauma, we know, for example, that the offspring of people that have had significant trauma are far more likely to then go on to develop PTSD themselves later in life. There's things we don't know about why that happens maybe, but we do know that things like that happen.
Yeah, totally. So important.
So to kind of dive further into the soup, right? When we talk about something like personality or temperament, what do we even mean? Like, what is it that we're talking about with all of this? What kind of behaviors or traits are we looking at or really discussing, when we look at the animal? Do you want to dive in on that one?
Go on, Kim. You
want me to start on that?
Yeah, go.
I mean, again, I have a bias of the ethological lens, but like I look at it like, it's phenotype is like the collection of all the things, right? So it's like we're looking at the learning, the environment, the genetics, and the individual self. So the external factors, interacting with the internal factors and the individual's genetics, and then their experiences within all those interacting parts. And I think that like it's the hodgepodge collection of all the things that at any given point kind of defines whatever the temporary personality is too. I mean, I think the personality is such a loaded word that gets interpreted and applied in so many different ways, depending on who's using it. And I think that it isn't as static as we even talk about it in human psychology. I think it's something that changes and shifts depending on all of those circumstances and how we're feeling on the inside and how we're, what are life conditions like on the outside. And, I think a personality might look a certain way in one set of conditions as a direct result of other factors. And then outside of those conditions, it's not the same at all. I mean, if you take me and you put me in a desk job for 8 hours a day, I am not going to be the same human being that I am living the life that I am currently living with my career the way that it is. Like, so, I think we undervalue the role of the environment, particularly in pet dogs, because we undervalue the incredible pressure of captivity. And we forget, like, this is a modern phenomenon. Like, for 10 to 40,000 years, for the large part, dogs weren't captive. And still in most of the world, they're not. Okay. So then but our pet reality here in the United States and in many developed countries is that their world is what we provide for them on leashes and fences, through sports, through activities, puzzle toys, and so the loss of autonomy, and then the loss of the freedom to express natural behaviors, the loss of the agency for reproduction, even, where natural selection is not getting to throw its hat back in the ring for what's working for those conditions. Like, so I think I like to remind myself and my clients and my students a lot about like putting enough attention and weight on the role that the environment plays. So we're not perceiving that phenotype in the moment as static, as determinative, for that individual, because I like to say, well, what are our opportunities to change that environment in profound ways so that we can find out maybe who that individual would be otherwise. And so that's my own personal kind of bias on it.
Anybody want to add anything?
Yeah, I'd say that's gorgeous. For me, personality is, a suite of behaviors that are relatively constant over time, but they can change. And I think it's very important to take into account what Kim just said about they'll be different in different environments. And that's not just true of animals, right? Like a plant would be different in different environments that you put it in. So all life adapts to its environment.
Or doesn't.
Or it doesn't.
Right?
In some cases.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
If it's
or
too
struggles
extreme.
to. Yeah.
I guess, again, there's not a lot to add there, but I think we've traditionally always talked temperament in dogs. Personality has become a word that's been used much more recent times, but we've always talked temperament. I guess, personality is just, there's no one definition. It's just, even in human psychology, it's just not. But we tend to think of temperament as being that more natural part of your personality, something that is more stable, coming more from the inherited side, a little bit harder to modify or manipulate, and something that's evident really young. Whereas personality, we're sort of mixing that into the learned habits and the behavior and the environment, so personality really takes in a lot of things, the inherited components and the acquired components. Whereas, you know, in dogs, like I say, I mean, temperament is the thing, you know, like it or not, some people are not very comfortable with temperament testing. Some people use temperament testing a lot. We've certainly known the working lines that temperament testing is very highly used, whether it's for military or police dogs, whether it's for assistance dogs, because the quicker they can identify those dogs that are likely to be successful, the better. And so we do tend to see that temperament is something that we can look at those traits early on and see those continue on. But they're so plastic, you know, at the end of the day, they're so flexible depending on the acquired experiences that the individual has. Yeah.
So I'm going to interrupt you guys for just a second and give out our first CEU code. So for those of you who do want CEUs for this, if you go to the link, I shared it in the chat, but you can also find it if you want to go to lemonadeconference.com/CEU. There'll be a big yellow button you can click on there. The first code to put in is FDSA-0212. It's going to be your first code, and we'll give you the second one in just a little bit. All right. So to kind of pick things back up, let's talk about genetics for a little bit. What do we know about the role that genetics play in a dog's kind of ultimate behavior as an adult? And you guys can feel free to kind of talk about your own experiences here too.
I feel like Sharon has had to go last multiple times. Maybe she would want to go first.
I was actually thinking Jessica definitely should go first. On this one.
Yeah.
This is a Jessica topic, this one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's let the
happy to.
geneticist take that one. Yeah.
I'm trying to be better about not always jumping in and running my mouth every time. So
that's why we're here though.
That is why we are here. So what is the role that genetics plays? It's just really hard to think about, right? Like, so people want to say, was this particular problem genetic, or how much of this problem was genetic? And I think that is not the right way to think about genetics in an individual. And so one of the ways that the guide dog schools are who I look to as the groups that are doing a really, really good job of taking a group of dogs and pushing over generations, pushing their behaviors in a particular direction really successfully. And they are doing that at the population level. And so at the population level, they're able to assess particular traits and say, this trait seems to be more controlled by genetics in this population. This one seems to be more controlled by environment, but that's at the population level. And what it doesn't tell us is that in this particular individual, is it that their genes were really pushing them hard in this particular direction and that's where they ended up? Or is it maybe in this other individual that they had some really powerful experience early on that pushed them way over in this other direction, and their genetics maybe for them didn't have as big an effect because they had that powerful experience, but maybe some other dog with very similar genetics ended up quite differently just by chance because they didn't have that powerful experience. So I think the best way that I like to think of it is that your genetics will be sort of pushing you in a particular direction as you're maturing, and your environment and your experiences are going to come on and push you in different directions. And so where you end up is as a result of that interplay, and there's no real way to pick it apart for an individual. But we definitely know that for personality traits, genetics certainly is important in the sense that if you look at the parents of a dog, the traits that those parents have are likely to be expressed in the puppy, but not for sure. But I mean, as you all know, if you want a puppy of a certain type, then you go look for parents who behave that way, and that is going to be your best bet of getting that kind of puppy, that and how you raise the puppy.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, done.
Sharon, you go next.
Okay. What do we know about genetics? It's a growing field. We know a lot and we know almost nothing. I mean, we've learned a lot more than we used to,
yeah.
But we still know next to nothing, really, compared to what we probably will know in 50 years' time. We've always known that exactly what Jessica said. If we go out and look at the parents, we've got a better chance of knowing what that pup's going to be like. I think it's important people don't think that there is a guarantee, though, because there isn't. Like, I mean, we know ourselves even in the human world. Siblings can be very different. They can have completely different temperaments. And so, yes, we look to the parents and the grandparents, and we look at those lines, and certainly we look at those breeds and those lines, and that gives us some information about the traits that are likely to happen in that pup, but it doesn't give us a guarantee. And I think exactly what Jessica said, the guys that are pushing, that are really doing well in this are the guys that are like where the research is really happening is in those working lines, whether it's the military dogs, the police dogs, the assistance dogs, because obviously it matters to them. If they can try to produce more dogs that are more suited to their end goals, that's a good thing. That's what they're trying to do. They're also the guys that do the most research in terms of accurate assessment of puppies to determine whether that puppy is going to go on to be sort of the dog that they need it to be, and they need that information as quickly as possible. So unfortunately, though, what it means is often in, say, the sport dog world, people want a lot of information about genetics and what we know. And the answer is, in the sport dog world, we don't know much more than we did a little while ago, because really there's just not research specifically being done on those type of traits. We're really looking still to the parents like we've always done. We do know a little more about behavioural pathologies and they're linked to genetics than what we used to. But again, is that really useful to the individual person going out to acquire a puppy? Probably not. It's interesting for the people in that field. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What made me think about a couple of things just from the ethological perspective is that, like, I think it's worth just saying out loud that nature's system of heritability of traits is completely functional. It can't afford not to be, right? Because there's this constant, like, economical set of considerations, whether that's economy of behavior or neuroeconomics. Like, you can't afford to keep producing, you as a species or an organism, you can't afford to, like, keep being something that isn't working in the environment, right? So nature is always selecting for what's working in those particular conditions. And I think there's two things that just completely changed the game with dogs. One is modern medicine, as it's changed the game for humans, because then everyone can reproduce more, whether or not it's functional for the individual and the conditions or not, which is usually the measure of success, is whether you can reproduce, right? Sustainably. And then the other factor of artificial selection, when we're actively breeding for what we want, which may not remotely be functional for the individual, it also produces more consistency in genetic output, because you're breeding, like, smaller gene pools, oftentimes line breeding individuals that are related to each other. So they're going to have some more consistency in traits than they would if they weren't line bred or bred within a closed, gene pool. And so, like, I think those are just kind of curveball factors that get thrown into the science of when we're talking about dogs and dog behavioral traits, because, there's so many things humans have bred dogs to do that very much affect their personality, right? Like, herding dogs are always the poster child example for this, because, like, the neuroethological considerations of just their hypersensitivity to sensory information is really valuable in a herding context, right? But it can be a real difficult thing for a pet dog in a home, just in a neighborhood with kids getting off the bus stop every day. And so, like, that's that whole thing about the environment. It's like you change the environment, it works really well in this original set of conditions that we selected it to function in, is a herding dog. But then outside of those conditions, it looks pathological. And so we might say, oh, that line of border collies has, reactivity, right? That would be like a real industry or kind of pop culture way to consider that behavior. But what if there's been a line of working border collies that have all happened to be in pet homes that are actually perfectly normal phenotypical representation of border collies, but they're in the environmental condition that actually makes them agitated and frustrated and, over aroused and under engaged chronically. And then, at what point does that kind of set of mental health considerations change the personality that they're passing on to subsequent generations? Like, I don't have answers for any of this, but it's just like my brain goes in that direction and echoes what both of you said, which is, we don't know. We really have no idea, but we can't as a culture ignore the effect of our influence, you know, as humans on, you know, what's happened to what would be the natural science of all those things.
Yeah. So maybe one thing we would want to say, when we've all been saying, if you want to predict what your puppy's going to be like, look at what their parents are like. But maybe we should add to that, look what their parents are like and what environment their parents are in.
Yes.
And consider whether that's going to be an environment similar to yours.
Great point, Jessica.
That would be super. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Because if you're going and you're checking out working border collies on a farm and then you're going to have them in the city. Right. Yeah. And you're going to have one in the city and planning on doing agility, you might experience a completely different dog that is genetically consistent to the heritage. Yeah. But it doesn't seem that way to us because we want it to be apples to apples. And we have this idea that like every dog you can put in any pet home. And as long as you're a great loving family who's providing it a good, healthy diet and veterinary care and walks and puzzle toys, that it'll be fine. And there's so many issues where we have the square peg in a round hole. And we're like, what's wrong with the square peg? Why has it got all these pointy edges on it? You know, like it's not fitting. And it's like, you know, I think we need to learn to make that round hole bigger so the square peg fits, or we need to start really talking about the different shapes and how much our artificial selection has diversified the phenotype of, you know, domesticated dogs.
And
not just,
go ahead.
Yeah, not just within a breed, but within lines within a breed, because the differences we see between, say, a working line and a show line, you might as well call them two different breeds in terms of their behavioral traits that we're going to see. So again, you know, the difference between a working line border collie that's on the farm working and a show line border collie is going to be vast. Same with field dogs. And in fact, what's interesting is the traits that are selected for in the working line are very actively selected against in the show line.
Right.
Not because they're just specifically looking for the morphological traits because they're really looking for that show appearance, but specifically if they have a dog that's very chaotic and very difficult to manage, but they've got a household full of a lot of dogs and it's a show home, and then those dogs actually get moved on. They're not kept in those lines to breed on because that dog is hard to manage. Whereas, you know, the show lines, they want a very different thing. Not that any of these things are right or wrong, but it does mean that when you head out the door, even if you're looking at a breed, you have to look further than that. You have to look directly to that parentage.
Yeah. Yeah. And all this in a culture that is said, it's all how you raise them, isn't it? You know, and yet down in the minutia, it's like, no, it's not all.
It kind of was more so like 30 years ago. It kind of was more that way because the genetic pool was very different.
Yeah.
The genetic pool 30 years ago was very different.
Yeah.
And, you know, basically, even though there was still artificial selection, there was a more sort of natural selection in some ways. And the dogs were more street dogs, but also realistically, because the dogs had to fit a certain mold, there was a lot more culling out of the breeding pool than there is now. And so dogs that growled at kids, they kind of got moved out of the breeding pool. Dogs that couldn't get along with other dogs, they got moved out of the breeding pool. But now those dogs are not getting moved out of the breeding pool. So we're dealing with a very different dog now. The generic dog, when we just say dog, we're dealing with a very different pet home dog now to what we did 30 years ago. Plus what you commented before, Kim, the expectations on those dogs, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, but the home, the raising, you know, dogs used to have to cope with half an hour of the kids coming home from school, going out in the yard, playing with the dog for a while and come back inside. Okay, the dog's tolerance for half an hour of children, you know, playing with them, very different to now the dog lives in the home and the child's in their face 24/7. Yeah. Very, very different requirement for the dog. And it's a short space of time.
Oh, totally different world. Expectations have gone up here. Like I always tell the story about my grandma, right? Because she had these Keishans and she'd say, you know, don't go near that dog while it's got a bone, he'll bite you. Right. And now like people don't just say that matter of factly, like if you get near that dog with a bone, he's going to bite you. It's like, oh my gosh, the dog would bite a child over a bone, you know, like that's horrible. But yet we don't, it's like breeding used to be a thing. Like breeders were like breeders, you know, that was like their life. That was like what they did. And they were really concerned about the dogs they put on the ground. I'm not saying some breeders aren't, because I think plenty of them are, but it's become such a pop thing that, like you said, there's a lot of dogs, more dogs in the population in general, because there's a lot of money to be made. And it's a product thing. It's a supply and demand thing. So there's a lot of people getting into it just because they can sell the dogs for a lot of money. And then, something as simple and succinct as the amount of time a dog spends inside as a measure, right? 30 years ago, I grew up in Atlanta, downtown almost, and the dogs were loose. In Atlanta, in a major city. And so they're out there meeting their own behavioral needs. They have the affordances to express those natural behaviors. So the level of their frustration is so much lower than it is now, where, like you said, we're packing on more and more stimulation, more and more pressure, more and more expectation, and have far less opportunities for them to express those behaviors or have any agency whatsoever. So it's kind of turned into this perfect storm. And yet people's expectations are higher than they've ever been.
Yeah.
You guys started to dive into what was going to be my next question already, which is going to be, what do we know about how dogs' experiences shape their behavior traits? But maybe you guys can take a step further, kind of, since you've already answered that for the most part, and talk about, what kind of behaviors or experiences do we want to think about offering to get the kind of behavior traits we want, or, kind of take it that next step so people have some takeaways here. Anybody?
That's got to be a Kim question, that one.
I don't know. I just blabbed on for a minute. I'll let you jump in.
Yeah. No, that's your sort of question, though. Exactly what you were just talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I for me, we're trying to personally, and this is my own soapbox, but we're trying to create a paradigm shift in the industry where we're getting away from the idea that more training, more manipulation of their behavior through whatever means is going to be the answer, that basically you can just reprogram them with this awesome little new technique. And again, it's not to say that those things aren't effective. They are effective at changing behavior, but are we getting to the source of whatever that dysfunction might be for the animal between the environment and the genetics? Is it that the animal, we're asking too much? And so for me, I'm thinking of ways that you can, I like looking at the phenotype and the whole picture of the dog's legs and finding out what are ways that we can provide an appropriate outlet for some of those natural behaviors in the same way we would if animals were in zoos. People have been doing this and calling it enrichment in zoos, but recognizing that there's a real welfare issue when you take an animal out of their natural habitat and you take away that autonomy. And what is a perfect fit of the kind of habitat to the niche of the organism. So when that same operating relationship isn't available to them to access because of captivity, we have to try to provide the closest thing we can to it in a way that's functional and appropriate and safe, which frankly a lot of the things that we've bred dogs to do historically are kind of by definition not going to be safe when it comes to hunting and some things like that. And so we have to take all that into consideration, which is why I want to bring Jessica back into this conversation and say the Functional Breeders Collaborative is where it's at. These kinds of conversations about how do we then change the gene pool to fit the world, maybe, right? Because I don't know that we're going to change our modern world to fit the dogs. I have a lot of doubts that humans are going backwards with any of the things that we have changed about our rate, in the environment. And so I think the answer is going to be in, okay, geneticists and breeders, how can we solve some of these problems by creating keys that do fit those locks?
Yeah, and what I've been saying there for a long time is that it's not a scientific problem to solve. We know how to breed dogs that fit into certain situations. We know how to breed dogs to sort of push their behavioral traits in particular directions. But it's a societal issue where we haven't been sitting down and saying, we have this expectation that we're going to produce dogs to be good pets. What does that look like? And are we going to prioritize that as the most important thing? The most important priority, the top priority for those breeders who are trying to produce dogs as pets. And there's still, I think, a feeling in a lot of parts of the dog community that if someone is aiming to produce primarily pets, or what we like to sometimes call sports light, not dogs that are going to world team, right? But dogs that are going to enjoy competing a little bit, which is what I like. People who are trying to produce that still get a bad rap a lot of the time. And that message is still out there in a lot of places that the only reputable place to go to get a purpose-bred dog would be a breeder who is putting, a zillion titles on them. If it's show lines, they have to be champions before they're bred. If they're working lines, they have to be, top of their game. And but that's not what the average person wants or needs, right? And there's a lot of constraints on how we're producing dogs like that. And so I think so Kim just said what her message was that she keeps hitting. The message that I keep hitting is, if you're breeding dogs to be working dogs, that's great. If you're breeding dogs to be show dogs, that's great. But there should be this other population of people who are intentionally breeding pet dogs and really thinking about, what is the right kind of dog to fit into the households that I expect my dogs to go to, and to prioritize that rather than other things. And it's surprisingly hard for breeders who want to do that to actually successfully do that, because there's a lot of societal constructs stacked up against them right now.
And I think so much of all of that you both just talked about comes back to educating the dog purchaser, educating the person who's going to go out and acquire that dog. And that means educating, full stop, the general public, not just what we tend to think of in that sport dog world or whatever, but the general public need to be educated that dogs are not all the same. They don't all start as a blank slate. And that they have to be looking for the traits that are going to fit their lifestyle. Like, that's going to be the most important thing. But I mean, also though, coming back to what you're saying about the sports dog, I think that differentiation between sort of what you might term the amateur sport dog trainer and a professional sport dog trainer. The unfortunate part there, and a lot of my background is with horses, and competing and training through to elite levels. And I know the main problem we have is the amateur horse competitor wanting to sit on an Olympic level horse and not realizing that maybe that Ferrari is not going to suit them when they need a family sedan. So at the end of the day, they want to see that really flashy horse with a big flashy movement that's really exciting to watch. They don't realize that horse needs professional 24-hour management. That is not the average pet horse that they can also let their kids have a ride on the weekend. And it's not even a horse they necessarily will feel comfortable riding themselves, even if they're experienced people. And it's the same with the dog sports. I see so often people go out and they're buying, agility, I guess, and the bite sports are the two things that mainly come to mind, because they're the high energy, high arousal, high intensity sports. And, they see those great videos of the dog sliding to a down, spinning around and sliding to a down, running at fast pace, doing these amazing things. And they want one of those because they want to go to competition with one of those. The problem is that dog is not going to be the same dog in the household as a different type of dog. And so, you've got to live with that dog 24/7. So, you have to take into account not just when you're on the field, but what's it going to be like in the rest of your life, which is the majority of the time you're going to spend with that dog.
Right. And professional confessions, across the globe, professional competitors with those dogs struggle to live with those dogs.
Yep, absolutely.
Right? The top people at the top of their game who know how to ride that show horse, they still are like, oh my gosh, living with this dog is making me crazy, So then though, people watch TikToks of those dogs and YouTube videos, and it's turned into this, it's almost like a car sales thing where it's like, oh, this dog is so sexy. Don't you want one of these dogs? Look, they can walk on a tightrope and,
blindfolded. They can walk on a tightrope blindfolded
and backwards, and then scale 30 feet walls and climb trees to get bad guys.
Until they scale your back fence and keep escaping.
Exactly.
They like to see a scale a 30-foot fence when it's on a video, but when it's at home and it's just escaping the backyard constantly, it doesn't seem so appealing.
Right. And so where's the reality check on those conversations? The public isn't hearing these conversations that we're having right now at all. They see one of those dogs walking through the park in a perfect heel, and they're like, wow, my
clearly
dog
that breed. If I just get a dog of that breed,
and then it'll do that.
Just do it.
It'll just do that. And never mind the fact that dog probably goes home and then, annoys the daylights out of whoever it was healing through the park or whatever. But I think that's the kind of conversation we need to be starting to have with the public, is that no, they're not blank slates. You're not going to get a puppy, and you just take it to a puppy socialization and a couple obedience classes, and then it will be your minion that does everything you want, and it will never annoy you, because it's a lie, and it's like a cultural lie that we have to lift the veil on.
Yeah.
And not just in that pet dog community, but in that amateur sports dog community.
Yeah.
It's really important to get that information in there, you know, but definitely the pet dog community. We see those dogs that are so intense and they, you know, maybe doing a search or something, and we see them and they just won't let anything stop them. But when you take that dog home and it tears through your lounge to get to one piece of kibble that was underneath the lounge, because they had that same level of commitment to get to that one piece of kibble.
Perseverance is a double-edged sword.
Dog has, you know, to get to that person. And it's the same. Yeah, it's just getting people to really look at you know, their lifestyle and whether that dog's going to gel with their lifestyle.
Yeah.
So that gives me a great opportunity to break in, give our second CEU code, and then kind of ask our last big question that I know you all wanted less time to talk about. So our second code for the CEU quiz is lemonade-0212. And again, you're going to access the CEU quiz by going to either the link that's pinned at the top of the chat box or hopping over to the Lemonade Conference website /CEU. And that'll have a big button that you can click on. And then you'll choose Melissa Breau. And I think it's got the name of our talk. So it's all in how they're raised, or is it? It's the name of the talk. So you'll choose that out of the drop-down list, and then you can input the codes. All right. So our last kind of big question, and then I'll give you some time for some final thoughts at the end. So everything we've been talking about, how do we take all of that and how should that really impact how we're choosing our canine partners, and then how we approach socializing them as puppies and young dogs, like what we actually do with them once we do have a puppy or bring a dog home. Who wants to start?
I guess you know exactly what we're just talking about. Match your goals to the selection process. And I would take that even so far as to say, if you want to bring a dog into your home, whether you're bringing an adult dog or a puppy into your home, and you are prepared to take whatever path that journey leads you on, and you are prepared to shape your lifestyle around your dog if required, and you have no set plans or goals or activities in mind, then you can truly take on whatever dog you want to, whatever dog you choose. But if you have set plans, whether it's sporting goals, whether you want to travel and you're going to stay in a different motel every night, or you're going to stay in a different RV park every night, whether your lifestyle means your dog's going to be left at home for extended periods of time on their own, if you've got a really hectic lifestyle, you've got lots of visitors coming and going, or you know you've got a sedentary lifestyle or a very active lifestyle, or you know you are fixed on being able to take your dog to the beach or the cafes or the restaurants, then you better select carefully. Because the number of consults that I'm involved in, because the people have a fixed idea of what they want to do with their dog, and that dog does not fit that mold. And they are desperately trying to shape that dog to fit that mold. And it ends up being harsh on the dog. And usually the people are still not at where they wanted to be. It's not the dog they planned on having. And I think you have to, especially now, and like I'm all for rescues and all the rest of it. What I think though is if you're going to take on one of those dogs, understand that that dog may never be a dog that wants to go to the dog park. It may never be a dog that wants to sit around at the cafe while lots of people and other dogs go by. If you're prepared to do whatever it takes to meet the needs of that dog, then absolutely that, you know, and I've seen people make it their life's work to make their dog happy. And I think that's fantastic. And there's lots of people doing that. That's amazing. But don't take home that dog and then be annoyed that that dog doesn't fit your lifestyle, or just try to make that dog fit your lifestyle. So I think you know, that's a huge one. I know you mentioned socialization, but I'm sure we probably all want to talk about that, and then we'll probably all talk about socialization as a separate issue. But yeah, that would be my big thing, and I think it's what we've all really been focusing on, is making that dog match the goals.
I also want to add to that there's something sort of romantic about thinking that you're going to, you know, make your whole life be about making your dog be happy. But when you ask the people who end up having to do that, if they would do it again, they pretty much always say no.
Yeah.
And I'm in that situation right now where I got a dog who I thought was going to be a good match for me and was not. And I'm exhausted from trying, you know, and if I could find him a better home, I think I would. But it's not fun to work that hard. It's not great for either member of the relationship, for, you know, So, you know, even when you try not to put yourself first, you try to say, okay, well, I had these thoughts and plans and they're not going to happen. And I understand that. It's important to understand that. Better to not get there in the first place if you possibly can avoid it, because it's exhausting.
That's so absolutely right, in that the class I'm running at the moment, which is working with reactive and hyper aroused dogs, there's like nearly 500 people on that private Facebook group, and I tell you now, all they do is share stories about how it's affected their life. They can't go for a walk comfortably, they're anxious all the time, they're hyper vigilant when they take their dog out, they need to take a friend with them every time because they have to monitor the environment so closely, they have to have escape routes, they can't have friends over to visit, they can't go away because they can't get an average pet sitter or a dog sitter, they can't leave the dog at a boarding facility. It changes their lives to a level that, like you say, it's romanticized, it sounds great, but when they're living it, it's really hard. Really
exhausting. Yeah.
You know, and then you talk to every behavior consultant worldwide, particularly in developed nations where dogs are in similar kind of constraints like they are in the US. And it's the same story, Sharon. Do you know, like every one of us has 500 of those people. Yeah. And then you realize what the scope of the problem actually is and how many people and their dogs are suffering chronically. Yeah. And yet the conversation we're having has been something that we have been told, don't have that conversation in the industry for a long time because of the "it's all how you raise them" mantra. People get shamed for giving up on a dog, for rehoming a dog, like you're abandoning them. You committed to adopt this dog and bring them into your life for the forever home as the family. How dare you, you know, make a choice to take care of your own family or your own personal welfare needs? Like that's so horrible that people are carrying that burden around, you know? I mean, and Jessica, you're educated, right? So like, you're exhausted, but you can at least understand what's happening, right? Like, whereas so many people, they don't understand what's happening. And we, you know, even very recently, yet again, kind of a perpetuation of the idea, and I understand one of the technical glitches, but that shelter dogs should have nothing about their genetics, you know, as part of their file or their kennel card or what have you, which the tricky hinge pin there is, you know, the fact that people misidentify, right? So like, that's a problem that we need to solve. I've thrown a hat in the ring that I don't think is a perfect answer to it with the dog key software. But it's something, but like, if we could only genetically test all of those dogs so that if it does actually turn out that that's like a 70% Malinois that you're about to take home, you might want to adjust the expectations and understandings and provisions and management and whatever going into it. Because like you said, if it was a puppy, we would be suggesting to people that they're being thorough and thinking about, you know, all of those factors and how well it's going to suit. It's not that there are breeds of dogs that are just bad, but it's like compatibility is a thing, right? Like we have to make sure that the key fits the lock at least as well as it possibly can. But it just breaks my heart hearing what you say, Sharon, and knowing like how true that is for like all the colleagues that I have and how much they're struggling, their clients are struggling, the dogs are struggling. And yet we know people will continue to spend money on their dogs. We love our dogs so much, even when they don't take care of themselves, people will take care of their dogs. So we definitely care. Maybe we're just as a culture not asking the right questions, and we're not being straightforward enough with the public.
And it's hard right now when I suspect both of you will have had the same situation of someone comes to you and says, I want to do the right thing and get a dog who will fit in well, you know, because we've been talking about the people who don't think about it. But when someone who is trying to think about it comes to you and says, I want to get a dog who's going to fit into my home well, I find it's really hard to know what to tell them. Traditionally, I would have referred someone to what we would have called a hobby breeder. So someone who produces 1 litter a year, 1 litter every other year, you know, puts titles on their dogs. And realistically, if you go find someone who does all the health testing, socializes exquisitely, realistically, you're going to have insane wait lists for someone like that. I talk to people who've been hunting for a dog, trying to do it responsibly, and they just don't even get answers when they contact breeders like that,
Mhm.
because those breeders have dozens of people,
Yeah.
dozens of people contacting them, and they're doing a litter a year or a litter every other year. And so, so then where do you go? And I think a lot of what we're seeing is that people who are not breeding as responsibly, and there's a huge gap there. There's a huge conversation to have about what responsible breeding looks like. So let's just say I'm not talking about everybody in the middle, but I am now talking about the people way on the other end who are doing extremely high volume breeding, producing many litters a year from many different breeds in kennels, not in home environments, not health testing, and not doing a great job of socializing, if any, right? So that far other end of this spectrum, those dogs are really easy to get. And it can be really hard to see that that's what you're getting, right? Because you're buying it over the internet. And so you have a picture of the dog growing up on the farm, and that's what you're led to believe. You're told that they're health tested, even if they're not. So, and those dogs, there's no waiting list for those. You can get one tomorrow. So I think a lot of what we're seeing is that it's really hard for people, even who want to do the right thing and even who understand, to navigate finding that just the sources of these well-bred and well-raised dogs are tapped out right now.
Yeah. And there's such an interesting supply demand issue, or even just market control issue, that just astounds me how quickly it's changed. And, when I was a kid, a purebred dog cost a lot of money, and a crossbred dog was free to good home because there was a mismating, or they were very cheap. And so at the end of the day, no one was making money out of breeding those dogs. And so they did tend to be that it was a good family pet that had survived up to reproductive stage. They'd got along with the kids and they got along with the neighbors' dogs, and everything was great. And that's the dog that got mated to the next door neighbor's dog because, the dog dug under the fence. And then they were, not very expensive. And so nobody went out of their way to do that. But you end up with these great pet dogs. But now, because it's just changed. I mean, I have standard poodles. I can buy a purebred standard poodle for half the price of a crossbred poodle, a poodle crossed with something else. And so, the market there for those crossbred dogs is so huge, and the money's so high, that everyone is getting into it without any knowledge about the dogs, without any knowledge whether that's a good cross between those two breeds, whether those two breeds are a good match for each other. And I'm sure, Kim, you could speak to that. I mean, you look at the traits of two different dogs. Just because they're dogs doesn't mean that the traits of two different dogs is going to get along and produce a great dog. And so we've got all of these issues, and a lot of it comes down to the fact that people are prepared to spend big money on these dogs. And so it puts a situation in play where people will breed them because they can make money out of it.
Yeah.
And
it's
so while
turned
the
into a
public are
whole
happy
new market.
to go out and pay that big money for that dog, it's a difficult challenge to be resolved.
Yeah. And, and we actually were talking about this in the Q&A with my session earlier today about the novelty of breeding. And so people are doing weirder mixes, with the doodles, like Tibetan Mastiff doodle. It's a thing. You're just but why though, and so even with just the breedings behaviorally and perception wise, to me, I think we walk a tightrope sometimes with creating dogs that have a lot of internal conflict because they have contradicting indicators in terms of the type of things in the environment that arouse them, that they care about, that they would normally respond to this way, and so that's an issue. But then all the more the phenomenon that we all have, right? Dogs, people, every organism, of being aroused by saliency, by novelty, and so it's it's out of pattern and we attend to it. So it's the flashy lights and what makes Vegas. And we're always trying to draw the attention through marketing for our products, whatever those are, by being flashy and different and blah, blah, blah. So dog breeders on this phenomenon is such a slippery, horrifying slope. And it is resulting in things like stuff I've just found out in the last few months, like toad line bullies. And the fact that that's a thing, that they're making toad line bullies, where they're
by
breeding,
the way, means bullies that look like toads.
They literally look like toads because they're so orthopedically disastrous. you know,
Yeah.
and so the things that we value that people will spend $10,000 on for a dog to look like a toad, because that's cool and weird, and people will come up to you in the park and say your dog looks like a toad. Like, I just feel like society has gone off the rails when it comes to a lot of this stuff with all of the like fad breeding. And then, like you said, people are spending obscene amounts of money on mixed breed dogs that probably aren't healthy behaviorally or physically, just because of the novelty factor and the fact that the internet can make them appear a certain way, you know, to purchasers that don't know any better.
Yeah.
All right. So
But
I'm going to round this up because our next
Yep.
session's starting
Yep.
in just a minute here.
Okay.
And I want to read our little outro for everybody. So, but thank you all for joining me. Jessica, Kim, Sharon, I really appreciate you all being a part of the panel. Big thank you to the audience out there in internet land. If people listening to this have not joined the rest of the conference, there's all sorts of other good stuff in the conference itself. Tickets are still on sale and will remain available through the end of the conference on Sunday. And all of the talks are recorded and are available for review. So if you've missed one of these awesome presentations these ladies did, you can always go back and catch it later. And we will be back tomorrow for another panel discussion. Tomorrow's topic is the future of R+ training. So I hope some folks will join us at the same time again tomorrow. See you then. I hope those who are registered enjoy the rest of the conference. And if you will all hang tight for just a minute, we'll go ahead and end our live stream here.